to this question and answer session with the Southampton Academic Skills Service. So we have 3 members of the academic skills team here today to answer some questions that students have sent in for this Q&A. So I'm Alice Steintorf, and I am one of the writing specialists with the team, and I'll hand it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Nicola, and I'm one of the members of the team working in study skills.
And hi, I'm Laura, and I specialise in mathematics and statistics.
Awesome. So there's us, and we will move along to the first question that we received.
Okay, so this is quite a popular question, and we understand that any exam time can be a stressful one for many. So by making a revision plan, so this question is asking about dividing your time between different topics and different modules having exams. So where do you start and what do you focus on? So it's important to make a revision plan. And that will make things more manageable for you. So probably start with making a list of the different exams that you have and listing how much revision each exam needs. And then you can start to write about how much time you want to spend on each of those exams, and then do a bit of background reading for each of those areas. And then once you've got that information together, you can start to break it down into manageable chunks. And then you can decide on whether you want to plan weekly or maybe a little bit further ahead. And Alice, thank you for bringing that the planner up on screen here. So this is a typical planner that you might want to use to plan those slots in for particular exams. You can use it throughout the year for different types of assignments you have as well. But we have our own time management weekly planner, which you can access from our academic skills site. But there's also up on screen here another sort of planner from a different university here, and the link's there if you want to have a look at that. But this blocks out in colour the different subject areas. So you could do something similar with days of the week and take that through into different weeks or months and highlight those different areas where you have different exams. Importantly, though, it's always making sure that you've incorporated any social activities in there, obviously resting, relaxing, and also just some empty blocks where you're just taking time out. You might be doing a different activity, meeting with friends, traveling, or meeting with family, or just having time out. So that's really important to just block out those periods of time. It also helps if you find out what type of exams you're being set. So you might have essays, you might have short answer exams, or you might have multiple choice. So you can find those out from your Blackboard site for your course. Look at the marking schemes as well, how many marks do particular pieces of work or exams carry. Look at your course notes as well, and lecture materials for reading, course reading. And also don't forget to look at those past papers so you can plan out that scheme of marking and how questions are weighted. And also have a practice, just do a practice run of some of those papers, and that will make it seem much more manageable when you get into the exam. We've got lots and lots of tips on our revision on our revision pages and our preparation and planning pages for exams, and lots of different ways for revising for exams. Some of those can include things like flashcards, mind maps, where you're plotting out the subject and then the connections with that subject to others, bringing them together in a visual way. You might want to use flashcards for recording things like dates and times and facts, or depending on the subject that you're revising. But you also might want to work with your friends or family and pretend you're teaching them as well. And that makes it a little bit, it will sink in a little bit more, the processes, and make it a little bit lighter for you talking to others or even recording yourself going over that exam topic to help process and understand that material. I think that's probably pretty much the key things for now on that topic.
Question. I've been told I need to work on my paragraph structures. Any tips?
So I think this question of paragraph structures is probably one of the most common that we get asked in academic skills, whether it's the hub or a kind of one-to-one appointment. So what can we do to strengthen our paragraph structures? So going back to basics, I think the first thing I'd say is to keep in mind that a well-developed paragraph should have one clear and central point of focus. So if you're getting feedback that your paragraphs are jumpy or they're incoherent or they're kind of cluttered, it might mean that you're actually trying to cover too much ground within one paragraph. So to help you with that focusing of a paragraph, I would keep in mind the position and kind of the point of the opening sentence of any paragraph. So we refer to that first sentence of a paragraph as your topic sentence, and it does exactly what it says on the tin. So that topic sentence should establish the topic that you will develop by the end of that paragraph. So it's almost the promise that you're bringing to the table. So if you say something like, nursing CPD can be delivered in several different formats, right? I would expect that by the end, as a reader, I will understand what those several formats are. I will have received examples of those. I will have received evidence and citations to demonstrate that variety, right? So if you need to work on your paragraph structure, first off, look at that first paragraph and make sure that you're doing something to establish focus. One thing that I see students do sometimes is immediately jump in with literature. So they'll say, Johnson 2024 says that blah, blah, blah. And it can feel appealing to just, get literature in as quickly as possible. But you want to be in the driver's seat as you establish what that paragraph is going to do. So second point, our companion to that topic sentence is going to be the final sentence of the paragraph. We refer to that final sentence most often as the takeaway point. You can also think of this as your so what moment a little more casually. So at the end of that paragraph, there should be a critical resolution where we understand, having established the topic and having developed it with evidence, literature, citations, commentary, what is the final point to be drawn out of that? So your reader, and that is to say your marker, is definitely going to be looking at that final sentence of the paragraph and wanting some sense of how this all comes together or how it matters in regard to the thesis that you established. So you have that overall focus of kind of your essay and what it's trying to do. Your final sentence of a paragraph is usually your chance to sort of drive home, here's why this matters, here's what we can learn from this. So going back to this question of paragraph structure, the tips would be establish that topic sentence, make sure you're resolving on that takeaway point, and in between, you're going to want to have a variety of literature and commentary that leads you from that point A to that point B. One final tip for checking your paragraph structure and how your paragraph structures make sense in regards to the whole essay is to use the reverse outlining technique. So we'll link to this in the video description, but the idea with a reverse outline is that once you've developed your essay, you look at each paragraph within that essay and try to boil the individual paragraphs down to just one sentence or just one kind of phrase or idea. If you struggle to do that, so if you look at a paragraph and you're like, I can't really summarize this in one sentence or with one main idea, you might have failed that focus test. So if you're not able to do that, it could be an indication that actually, again, you've gone back to that initial problem we discussed of moving between too many different topics within the same paragraph.
One for me. I'm not understanding some things in my stats module, but feel like my questions are too basic to ask. Oh no, ask them. Oh my gosh, please don't hold yourself back. It's completely fine to ask questions, doesn't matter what they are. Like, you are at university to learn. It's not really anything more than that. You are here to learn. If you don't know something and you need to find it out, how are you going to find it out? You need to ask. Like, if you never get anything wrong, where is your learning taking place? Sometimes admitting that we don't know something and then doing something about it is the most useful thing that you can do, especially at this level. I remember when I was a student, and this is one of my clearest memories of being an undergrad. I was in a module about vector calculus, and I could not understand what a vector space was. It just didn't click for me. And eventually I just asked my lecturer, I don't understand it, what is it? And that hesitance that I felt just held me back all those weeks. And he explained it so easily, and all of a sudden it clicked, and weeks worth of material suddenly made sense. I was thinking, why didn't I ask it earlier? Like, I would have been at this level so much earlier. And not knowing something is, it can be a bit intimidating. But please ask questions. It doesn't matter what they are. I love easy questions because they're easy to answer, and then both of us feel good. Yeah, ask your questions, please.
So this question is, I sometimes struggle with staying focused in lectures and get behind when taking notes. How can I get better at this and improve for next year? Now, this question's a very common question, particularly with new students. You might be new to university, and you come from a background where lectures maybe are much shorter or just formatted in a slightly different way. Suddenly you come to university, everything's changed, they're much longer lectures, or you have seminars, you're not quite sure how to work with others or stay focused or pay attention in those particular format style teaching sessions. So some of the key points will be things like looking at your module handbook regularly. You don't have to look at it every day, but just sort of glance at that fairly regularly to look at those kind of learning outcomes and understanding where everything fits together for your course, or at least that particular module. Look at your weekly pre-readings and activities, preview the lecture notes if you've got those, and actually annotate them as well. And this will allow you to ask any questions, or be in a good position to ask any questions in the lecture and then stay focused while the lecturer is talking to you. The other thing is to, when you're in the lecture, is to sit somewhere that you can concentrate. So turn off those distractions and listen to how ideas are being organised. How is the lecturer sort of explaining the topic? And this will help you focus later. Also, record things like cue words that you're hearing. So these might be things like crucially, significantly. These are words wrapped around particular topics or concepts that you really need to pay attention to. And also think about taking notes and the structure of those notes. They need to be fairly brief while you're in the lecture, and perhaps develop your own shorthand while you're in the lecture. I know that's one thing that students do struggle with. They feel they have to sometimes take down every single thing that the lecturer says. But it's really taking those sort of shorthand notes, taking those key points down, laying everything out well, and staying in the present and concentrating. And then after the lecture, you can then review those notes, annotate them if you need to, with your own comments, organise them in a way that sort of you can find things later more easily, revisit them regularly, and also discuss with your friends, with your peers, and this will help aid understanding and keep those topics in your mind and in sharp focus. And then lastly, as you can see on the screen, we've got an infographic here that hopefully will help you remember how to break these areas down that we've just been talking about. Note-taking techniques. Again, we have lots of tips and hints on our website, but there are so many different ways of taking notes. There are common ones, which are like the linear style, which is basically taking notes in a list style down a page. There's also a pattern style you might like to use where you're linking topics together to make connections, or you can combine both of those if you wish, or use a completely different format, whatever suits you in terms of remembering what what the lecture's been about. The other thing is using things like coloured tabs or highlighting areas of your notes. And importantly, it's using your own words, because you're far more likely to remember those later. So as you can see on the diagram on the screen here, so it's all about that preparing. What do I do before I go into the lecture to help me really focus and ask those really important questions that I need to ask about that particular topic? In the lecture, stay focused, concentrate, find a good position within that lecture space for you or that seminar, listen actively, and make sure we're taking down those key concepts. And then after the lecture, make sure your notes are put together in a fashion that you can find them. And then taking those notes using your own words and different formats like index cards and highlighting at the end. So our next question is, I always have a hard time getting started on my writing. How can I make this easier?
Yeah, that's the question of the hour. So I think it can, more than anything, feel a bit psychologically intimidating to get started on assignments. For some people, self-included, there can just be this real aversion to making that first step. So I just want to say first, it's a really normal thing to experience, so don't beat yourself up about it if that does describe you. But we'll go through a couple tips for kind of how getting started on the assignment can be easier. The first thing, though, that I think you should check, so if you consistently have a hard time getting started on assignments, my first question to you would be to reflect on how much time you're spending breaking down and understanding the expectations of the assignment. So if you get an essay brief or kind of a project brief, and you think, all right, I need to immediately sit down and start writing something, but you haven't taken the time to really reflect on fully what's expected of you, what you need to do in terms of research and reading, what you need to construct in terms of an argument, well, of course, you're not going to be able to start it because you're kind of flying into the darkness at that point. So we have a guide on understanding the assignment that can help you with that process if you think that that might be what's holding you back. But let's assume that actually you understand the expectations of the assignment, you understand what it is you need to do, but you're still having trouble making that start on it. I think one of the kind of nice writing strategies that you can use to combat that barrier a bit is to engage in a bit of what we refer to as free writing. So the idea of free writing is that you set initially a very short timer. I would say no more than 3 minutes tops. And the idea of that is you get your topic in mind, so what it is that you need to write. Start that timer, and for the next 3 minutes, whether you're typing or writing by hand, you do not stop writing. That might sound easy. It's actually a little trickier than it sounds. So when you're free writing, you very well might end up writing things like, and then something, and I don't know what I would say here, and oh, what's happening? But you just keep writing, keep writing, keep writing. So do not stop. If you write by dictating, you can also do free speaking where you don't stop speaking. So perfectly usable with that too. Now, the idea of this isn't that you're going to end up with necessarily material that you can use in your final submission, but that you're breaking that psychological barrier of feeling like I haven't done anything yet, because you will have done something. So once you do that free writing, what you can do is then set a 5-minute timer and read over what you've written and see if there's anything that stands out in terms of little gems hiding there in the raw material. The phrasing will be bad. It'll probably be phrased in a really sloppy, casual way because you were doing this with a timer. But just focus on the ideas. So focus on potential. Circle or highlight anything you see that looks like it might be usable. Then if that felt like a good start, set a slightly longer timer and free write again. So maybe now you free write for 5 minutes, or if you want to be really ambitious, 10 minutes. And you can repeat that a couple times. So it's a way of breaking in where you're not actually using that much time. So if you give yourself 20 minutes, you can do 2 or 3 rounds of free writing and then culling your material. And that will give you an entry point where you might have discovered some key ideas that you can use to build an outline or a mind map and make a proper start on what it is you need to do next. Now, the other tip I would give you related to that mind mapping point is that if you have trouble getting started on your assignment, I would encourage you to take a combined critical and creative look at how you're defining starting on an assignment. So there are some writers who kind of define that starting point as, okay, I begin with my introduction and then I proceed through the essay. That is the right way to write a paper. And it's just not necessarily the right way. So you can start your assignment at any point in it, first off. Maybe there's a particular kind of body paragraph that you know you'll need to write. So there's one key idea that you're excited about writing and you have an idea of what you'll write with that. Fine, jump to that. Ignore the introduction for now. Ignore the rest of it. Start where you feel confident and interested in starting. The other way that you can get a bit creative with that getting started is to not necessarily begin with rough drafting, but instead begin with an activity like a mind map, like a diagram. You can even do something like create a vision board for your assignment, where you sort of put images of key figures or visuals or doodles that represent ideas that you'll need to discuss and start to build that out. And again, what some of these slightly more creative activities might do for you is combat that feeling that you need to start the assignment proper and do it right the first time. Because I think a lot of times when we have trouble getting started on something, it does come back to either a little bit of writing anxiety or a little bit of perfectionism. And if you're dealing with that perfectionistic voice, it can be helpful to just give yourself the freedom to be a bit playful with what your start to the assignment looks like. And once you've engaged in those activities, you'll start to build your confidence around the content. And once your confidence with the content begins to grow, the confidence in your rough drafting will start to follow. So those are just a few tips for getting started on an assignment if you're having a struggle with that.
I don't get the concept of a mathematical proof. Why do we have to do this? Can't we just say something is something? No, unfortunately not at university level. Proofs are an act of communication on something that is mathematically true, even if we have a skeptical audience to it. So in mathematics, we study statements, and they can either be true or false. How do you know? You have to prove it. You know for a fact that 5 plus 5 equals 10. How do you prove that? What if you encountered someone who is convinced that 5 plus 5 equals 9? How do you convince them that they are wrong and you are right? You need to prove it. And when it gets to like really quite high level mathematics, sometimes, you encounter people who don't understand. So how can they understand? You use proof to prove that your statement is true. It's an argument that's made to demonstrate why a mathematical statement is true. It's clear, it's precise, it's unambiguous. You can't argue against it. Proofs help us to understand not only how something is true, but why it's true. And it's a very important thing in mathematics, not only to be computationally correct or to be fast in your computation. These are nice things, sure, but how do you communicate these things? How do you communicate your idea is correct? How do you convince someone that something is true? How can they use that to then build upon something else? So unfortunately, we can't just say that something is something. We need to communicate that something is true. That's why.
So this question is, I keep getting feedback about my writing or point not being clear, but I'm not sure how to address this. I don't see this when I read essays before submitting. What can I do?
So I'll have to admit, first of all, that this is one of those bits of feedback that can sometimes appear on writing that bothers me. Because when a marker says that your point or your writing isn't clear, that's actually a really unclear comment to make. Because writing can be not clear in so many different ways. So if you're consistently getting feedback that your point or your writing isn't clear, it does indicate something needs to be done. But the steps you take to resolve that might be a bit different depending on that definition of what isn't clear. So if you are able to visit your teacher during their learning hours or during their office hours to have a discussion with them and get a bit more insight about what's not clear, I'd say that's your starting point, because that's going to be really helpful. Now, if for some reason they aren't amenable to that or you don't feel comfortable with that, I would say that going somewhere like the Academic Skills Service, but also going to other resources like peers to kind of get a second set of feedback on, what is it about this that isn't clear would be helpful. A couple of the main things that might be going on. I'll start with the one that feels potentially most evident. So first off, what can be happening if they're saying your writing isn't clear is that there might be language level issues occurring. So it might be not clear in that literally your sentences are kind of tricky to read. So it could be that there's a lot of grammatical errors. That's one example of not clear. It could be that in an attempt to sound academic, you're writing really, really, really long sentences that are super burdensome for the reader. And by the time they get to the end of them, they're like, I don't know what the point of this was. So figuring out if it's a language level issue is helpful because that's something where I would suggest the strategies that you use would be in the proofreading and editing realm. So in terms of proofreading or editing, we do have a video learning sequence to support this that I'll link in the video description with some different strategies you can use. But a quick run through of those would be trying things like reading your work out loud. And when you read out loud, being very careful and methodical. I would even drag your finger along the screen or along the page to sort of make sure you're reading exactly what's there. This can be super beneficial because when we proofread silently, we sort of fill in the blanks and we read what we meant to write or what we think we wrote. Whereas if we're reciting it out loud, we're suddenly like, wait, what? Why have I just said horse when I meant to say house? Or you might realize I've run out of breath before I even get to the end of this sentence. That's an indicator that it is not going to come across clearly to a reader. You can also use proofreading strategies like having someone else read it out to you. I know that can feel a bit vulnerable, but it's amazing how clarifying it can be for someone else to read your work to you. Because when their face starts to do weird things like, you probably will realize like something is going on that you need to address. So you can follow along and sort of mark any areas that they struggled with because your marker is probably going to struggle with those same areas. So if it's language level stuff, that's some of what I would recommend. Now, in regard to your point not being clear, if the point in your writing isn't clear, that can be happening even if the language you're using is really clear. So if the point isn't clear, I would encourage you to revisit a couple of key spots in your essays before you submit them. The first and most evident would be your introduction. So in your introduction, you should be establishing what the primary focus and potentially main argument of this piece of writing is. And that should come across with just 100% like glaring headlights on it for the reader. You do not need to be subtle when it comes to your thesis. In fact, I would argue that being very direct about it, in letting the reader know this is what this essay is going to do, this is what it's about, is good. Because of course your point might not feel clear if you haven't established it from the outset. The second thing I would encourage you to do is, before you submit your essays, have a look through and do a round of editing where this sounds a bit weird, but what I would encourage you to do is actually make a new copy of your document and take out everything except the first and final sentences of your paragraphs. Odd, I know. But if you're getting feedback that the point in your essays isn't clear, we should be able to almost do a test run of whether you're establishing your points by looking just at the topic sentences and takeaway points. So if you take out all the rest of it, all the development, all of the evidence, just with those topic sentences and takeaway points, we should still have a flow of ideas that's logical. So here's my thesis. Now here's my first subtopic. Here's why it matters. Here's my second subtopic. Here's why it matters. Here's my third subtopic. Here's why it matters. We should be able to move through those in a methodical order that makes sense. Now, if you read those in a row and you feel like, actually, these aren't building on each other, there's not really a logical connection between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, or paragraph 3 and paragraph 4, that's a sign that potentially your point is going to feel unclear to that marker ultimately in the end. So that's something that I would recommend if the kind of writing isn't clear in terms of what you're trying to say. It might be that you're not paying explicit enough attention to building either your focus in that introduction for the whole essay or within each body paragraph for those supporting paragraphs that ultimately draw us towards your conclusion. Thank you for watching and for joining us today. Those have been just a few questions across writing skills, study skills, and math and statistics skills. We do have many more recorded workshops as well as written guides, so check out the rest of our channel as well as our website for the Academic Skills Service at Southampton for more support and resources.